Hello everybody, we are live. Ian Bradley is here, Frank Griffith is here. We'll be back after we've heard Laura. Hello, we are the Duke Ellington Society UK online. My name's Anthony Pepper. With us this week, Ian Bradley as our special guest, and Frank Griffith is back. Hello, everybody.
This is Uptown, Lockdown.
Something very, yes, that's right, yes. So it's better than the alternative title that we had, which was the Downtown Lock Up. Yes, that was the alternative. It's in some
Well,
way,
give it time. Give
give
it
it
time.
time. It's a some way better title. But anyway, so Ian Bradley, long-term member of the Duke Ellington Society and Duke Ellington Society Organising Committee, and also editor of our journal or magazine Blue Light for several years. That's his. I think that's his valedictory edition that came out about the end of 2018. So welcome, Ian. Thank you so much for being here. Just put that back carefully there on the shelf. So what did we just hear?
That was Laura, a nice ballad feature for Paul Gonsalves, and it's from the album Duke Ellington Presents, which was recorded for the Bethlehem label in February 1956, a year that obviously turned out to be very significant for the orchestra. I think it was a monster session over a couple of days in February that produced two albums, Historically Speaking, which was kind of Duke's greatest hits in a way, and then Duke Ellington Presents a series of kind of ballad settings for various soloists, and Paul Gonsalves soloing on Laura, which was arranged by Billy Strayhorn.
Right. I would have thought a Duke's greatest hits recording would take up about 20 chunks of vinyl.
Oh, there were there were reworkings, I think, of some of his most significant pieces. I think that was the album where there was a reworking of Coco, where the critical masses were up in arms because the tempo was quicker than they thought it should have been. So it's things like Coco, East St. Louis Toodaloo in one album, and then Standards for the other one.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, so Coco, they do take it at quite a lick, don't they?
Yes.
They're very impressive. But actually, I think there's a live performance from 1940 where they play it much faster than on the Victor record. So, yeah, the band did play things at different, in different manners over the years. Well, or even in the same year. So we're here, of course, today. Let's just say this: we're here, of course, to celebrate Paul Gonsalves. He was born in 1920, last Sunday. So he would be 100, but unfortunately he's not. But it is his centenary. It was 3 days ago, the 100th anniversary of Paul Gonsalves' birth, and so we are here to celebrate that today.
Yeah, thinking about things, I've been listening to quite a bit of Paul Gonsalves over the last couple of weeks and thinking about appearing today on the programme, and thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much for being here.
I'd be hard-pressed, really. I know that Duke Ellington didn't like categories and labels, and I know he wasn't too fond of the label of jazz, and you almost wish that the term soul music hadn't been taken for a different genre, because to me, that describes perfectly what set Duke Ellington's music apart in many ways. And of the Ellingtonians who were kind of selected for having that quality as musicians, I can't think of a musician more soulful, if that's the right term, than Paul Gonsalves, who communicated so much of himself through his music honestly and directly, and made him a very attractive and interesting musical personality. So it's definitely a celebration worth having, celebrating his centenary.
As an example of that, this particular book here is called Beyond Category, Life and Genius of Duke Ellington, and written by John Edward Haas. And a great book. I just happen to have it conveniently parked behind me here. Paul, as will be evident today, did record a fair amount in other settings besides Ellington. And Ian, I understand you brought a number of examples of that, including some small group sessions with other tenor sax players.
Yes.
And I await hearing those because they're quite different players in terms of stylistically from Paul. So, very much beyond category.
I mean, obviously, to take nothing away from his expertise, I mean, is interesting in the sense that when you think what a professional musician working at that level has to do in terms of technique, the physical effort of producing a sound, the tone, tempo, making all those kind of intellectual choices, to be able to do all of that, and then at the same time to kind of express himself. I think jazz sometimes suffers from that inverse snobbery, doesn't it? That people think they make it up as they go along, or they're untutored, and yet the level of skill and sophistication, a phenomenal musician, but a courageous and generous man as well, to be able to mediate himself through all of the demands of the professional musician.
That's right.
Yeah,
So Frank, go on.
Sorry, I defer to the the chief,
Hello. So no, I was also just going to say that jazz musicians have to play such a diverse repertoire as well. It's not as if, and not to diminish any other art forms, but it's not as if, for instance, in folk music or classical music, there is a standard repertoire almost. And yes, new pieces do come along, but in jazz, new pieces are always there. As well as obviously your improvisation.
Yeah, and in Paul's case, his small group dates, which included pairings with Sonny Stitt on a few occasions, and of course the one with Harold Ashby, and I believe maybe even Ben Webster on one occasion. But the point being is that he never treated it as he was the leader or it was his recording. He was always mucking in as if you like, supportively and evenly as he could, and yet his playing and sound was so high quality and distinctive that one never lost sight of the fact that it was essentially his album.
I hope that the tracks I've selected do his artistry justice. They're kind of more like scenes from a life, really, just illustrating various chapters in his career. But one of the ones that I was thinking of hoping I could play was "Tell It the Way It Is," a title track of an album he did for Impulse in the early 60s. But the track is about 15 minutes long. And as you say, Frank, he doesn't play a huge amount of that himself in that time. No, a very kind of generous player.
Yeah, great musician.
So we'll let people find that for themselves.
Yeah. Yes.
Which I'm sure won't be impossible for them. So what shall we hear?
Well, I thought it would be good to kind of start the Paul Gonsalves story with the early months of his career with Duke Ellington. I think when he actually started with the orchestra, there isn't a definite date. I think it's kind of the late summer of 1950. And certainly his first recording with the orchestra was for Columbia in, I think, November of that year. Love You Madly, Build That Railroad in Great Times, I think. And he did a solo on Solitude for the Masterpieces album in 1950. But I've chosen an air check from January 1951, the 2nd of January, I think. I don't know much about it other than it's in New York. And it's the band's theme, Take the A Train, which went through kind of various versions, didn't it, between its original recording and Reveille with Beverly, and Manhattan Murals and so on. It occurs to me it would be pretty much 10 years to the month after the first original recording of it. But I know Duke wasn't one for anniversaries, so it's just coincidence. But what sealed the deal for me on this was it's Billy Strayhorn on piano, and then Paul is afforded 64 bars at the end of the number, which is kind of a precursor to that version that would appear on Ellington Uptown a year or so later. So from his earliest days with the orchestra, I think Duke clearly recognised his talent and was happy to showcase him in that way. So it's from January 1951, the orchestra's theme, Billy Strayhorn on piano, and Paul on the exit with 64 bars of his tenor.
enthusiastic and emotive Paul Gonsalves in 1951 from an air check, and recorded 10 years after the original recording of Take the A Train, and in this case, a much more bombastic and sort of spirited version of that classic that Ellington's band played through all those years, in many cases in different tempi, different arrangements, different treatments, but all very much the tune ringing through. And our guest today, Ian Bradley, is going to present some different aspects and different periods of Paul's great recording output. And I'm quite interested myself in the Sabi Lewis Orchestra. So could you please tell us, Ian?
Right. Let me just interject and say that our chairman, Mike Coates, has joined in here, and we'll be hearing from him hopefully throughout the afternoon. Welcome along. Welcome along, Mike. We've got him into Zoom there. That's great. So yes, indeed, as Frank was saying, Ian, please go on.
Yeah, sure. Well, the version of Take the A Train that we heard was about 5 years after Paul's first commercially recorded solo, which, as far as I know, was with the Sabi Lewis Orchestra in 1946. Paul was born in Brockton rather than Boston, but was kind of local to the area. I think the family moved to Pawtucket when he was still a child, and after a spell in the army, when he returned to Civvy Street, I'm guessing that the engagement with Sabi Lewis was one of the earliest professional engagements that Paul had. Sabi Lewis operated out of Boston. I don't know if territory band is quite the right term by this stage, by the kind of the post-war years, but I think his fame largely rested around the Boston area. And in fact, one of the tracks I brought along today is called Boston Bounce. So he was a Bostonian, a piano player, a friend, I guess, or an associate of Paul's from kind of from way back and from the Boston days. It's interesting, I suppose, in a way, as another reed player, that Paul originated from roughly the same areas, kind of Johnny Hodges and Harry Carney. You don't know if there's something in the water or something. And also that Sabi Lewis was the first of three piano playing band leaders with whom Paul took up. As I say, I think it's his first commercially recorded solo. When Paul was in the army, he served in India, in Calcutta, and sat in frequently with a local musician there called Teddy Weatherford. And there were several sides issued by HMV India, which it is alleged Paul participates in, though I can't pick him out. I think he played alto and clarinet as well as tenor. So he's a well-practiced and a well-versed musician. But the engagement with Sabi was his first kind of professional engagement. With regard to the recording session, they're the only two tracks, in fact, I have access to by the Sabi Lewis Orchestra. And there are two titles. Boston Bounce was kind of second up for the day's recording. The first one is a tune called Edna. I've no idea who Edna is. I know we heard Laura for the intro music. I don't know if Edna was another face in some misty light somewhere, what her relationship was to Sabi Lewis, but that's the title of the tune. I think possibly Sabi Lewis's band styled itself a little bit after Count Basie more than Duke Ellington, as we'll hear from the recording. There are 8 pieces in the band. Again, discographical information is quite sparse. It's Sabi Lewis on the piano. There's a brief alto solo just before Paul takes to the microphone by a musician called Jimmy Tyler, who I've not heard of since, but preserved for all time now. And then Paul's solo on the tenor sounds pretty recognisably Paul Gonsalves, though he was about 26 years old when he recorded it, so clearly been practising and working for a number of years before he recorded this tune. So it's called Edna. So that was Edna, who sounds quite a lively character. As I say, there's a kind of a bassy kind of element. I'm sure that's who Sabi Lewis had styled himself after in his piano playing. And as you were saying, Frank, those kind of jump tunes are typical of the time.
They were similar to people like Jimmy Lunsford, very much so.
Yeah.
Bands like Jimmy, Lucky Millinder,
Yeah.
the jump bands that would later inspire people like Louis Jordan, who is, as you know, a singer and a saxophonist, who essentially created what became the modern jump jive blues.
It's interesting you should say Jimmy Lunsford, because I think it was when Jimmy Lunsford's orchestra visited near to Paul's hometown that kind of inspired him to want to take up the saxophone and to become a musician. And it was Willie Smith in the orchestra, the alto player, to whom he was kind of drawn initially. And it's one of those kind of strange coincidences that for a brief while at least, Paul would play alongside Willie Smith in the Ellington Orchestra in the early 50s. So Lunsford was a great inspiration to Paul Gonsalves wanting to have a saxophone. I think he went around the house mimicking and miming having a saxophone until his father finally surrendered and bought him one for about $50 to practice on. So yeah, I think Lunsford's spell must have been really quite widespread, wasn't it, at that time? It was a fabulous orchestra.
Willie Smith stands out for not only playing with both bands, Lunsford and, of course, Duke in the 1950s, but he also did very long stints with both the Charlie Barnett and Harry James big band, which would naturally be quite a departure from the previous bands we mentioned. But of course, he was that strong a character, you know, that his presence, his sound was so strong that he pretty much fit in everywhere.
Yeah, it's part of the great James robbery, wasn't it, called, when you aligned Willie Smith, Juan Teasdale, and Louis Bellson.
And the drummer from Basie called Sonny Payne.
Right.
But that was, he purloined him from somewhere else. But Sonny Payne was one of the really signature drummers with Harry James.
It was kind of a time of real change, wasn't it, in the Ellington Orchestra from the 40s into the 50s. And Clark Terry, a kind of contemporary of Paul, really, and a fellow member of the Basie band where Paul subsequently was employed following his stint with Sabi Lewis. Quite a lot of kind of new sounds and a kind of a renewal of the kind of Ellington colours and orchestra, wasn't it? In fact, I think when Paul was with the Sabi Lewis Orchestra, I mean, perhaps hindsight is a wonderful thing. His solo really shines out in these 3-minute records. And I think Paul was the great draw for the Sabi Lewis Orchestra when they were performing in Boston and the environs. And word obviously got to Count Basie, who I think came and saw the Sabi Lewis Orchestra, certainly took Paul from there into his own band, where he would have met Clark Terry and the kind of the new breed of players going into the Ellington Orchestra.
And what's also interesting about Paul is that he could have been seen as a slightly late bloomer, in the sense that you had mentioned that he was pretty much free and easy, as you said, Civvy Street, by the quote, you know, late age of 26, which, you know, was normal then because of the war, because they were unable to work, to be in the States and pursue their career because of the war. But at the same time, he presumably didn't join Ellington until he was 30, which some people think, as you know, the other long-standing saxophonist pretty much started with Ellington when they were in their mid-20s.
Yes, quite a late bloomer. As I said, I know he served in India. I presume I think he went over there in 42, and I presume for the duration of the war. But he was obviously just a very seriously minded and skillful musician, and I imagine got employment really quite quickly when he returned. But yeah, 30 is it. So certainly that solo on Edna and on the next track, Boston Bounce, recognisably Gonsalves, and he's kind of sprung onto the scene, kind of fully formed, hasn't he? I think it's just the limits of the 3-minute side, and I guess Sabi Lewis's orchestra wasn't exactly Premier League, so he was such a draw, such a talented musician that obviously before long he was picked up by kind of one of the big guns and Count Basie. And Boston Bounce, talking with Anthony before the programme, if time was short, it's almost a kind of a repeat of Edna. It's very similar sort of territory, but again, just a rarity that's not aired very often. So I brought it along to play this afternoon as well. So we've Boston Bounce also named for the area.
Boston Bounce there. Basie-esque piano and a bit of Take the A Train thrown in.
I suppose they stole from where they could. It's hard to imagine there would be bands virtually on every street corner, wouldn't there? And stock arrangements and variations on themes and whatever they could find to fill an evening's dancing, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to great arranger, composer, Bill Finnegan. All those great arrangements for both Miller and Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey.
Yeah.
And then formed his own band in the 50s with the Eddie Sauter, who of course wrote for Benny Goodman. And Bill, who only died about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, he lasted until his early 90s. And he was a spry man of late 70s when I studied with him over 25 years ago. But he used to call protecting the parts. And Ian, you mentioned stock arrangements, and they were arrangements that were written for a full big band, as we heard, but they all had to be made to work for four horns as well. When they didn't have a full big band, they would have four that have a trumpet, that have a trombone, and maybe alto and tenor sax. Four horns, or sometimes six, all different numbers, but at the very least four. And as Bill used to refer to it, because he was doing these arrangements in the 40s, he said you had to protect the parts, which meant protect as if someone was going to steal them or something.
Yes.
But what he meant was that you had to give these four instruments the best note possible to make up the harmony. Yeah. As you say, I'm sure there were many bands in Boston at the time that only had four horns, and possibly Paul was in those bands as a development player.
So, and I know there were only 8 pieces, I think, in the Sabby Lewis band. Sure. And so from there, anyway, at least to a bigger band, to Basie, though they were all struggling, weren't they? I think at that time, as the kind of Sinatra effect took hold, and I think Paul was with Basie for 3 or 4 years, and then did about roughly a year with Dizzy Gillespie. Again, there just isn't the time to play the music from some of those orchestras. But I think he followed Illinois Jacquet into the Basie band. He was a replacement there and took on, I think, Mutton Leg was the big feature there, and I think Paul acquitted himself admirably with the Basie band. But I think Basie, I don't know exactly the time of this or when this happened, but Basie reduced to an octet for a while, didn't he, as the 40s became the 50s. And Dizzy Gillespie did the same as well. So Paul was with Dizzy Gillespie, I think, for about a year. He was quite surprised that he was kind of chosen to be in the Gillespie band, because I know Ellington famously said, for the avant-garde, I have Paul Gonsalves, but I don't think Paul felt he was a bebopper in that sense. So he was quite surprised to be taken on by Dizzy Gillespie, but was with him and with a young John Coltrane for about a year then, before a period of unemployment, I think. And he would have been kicking around New York in 1950 with Charlie Parker, who if I knew, I'd forgotten. It's his centenary year, isn't it, as well? When Carl Woidett was on the other week talking about Charlie Parker. And Paul and Charlie kind of hung out together and went out on the rowing boats on the lake in Central Park. And when he was down to his last $7.50, Paul thought, well, I need to find useful employment. So went to Birdland, where Duke was in residence, and kind of went to his table after he'd had a few drinks at the end of the evening. And Ellington said, I've been looking for you, sweetie. Come to the office tomorrow. And that was how he was taken on board with the Ellington band. But there must have been heady times and quite good company.
I just noticed in your possibly your next track, that Paul also played guitar.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about his...
Sure.
Please.
Yeah. I'm sorry to jump about kind of chronologically, but it's just kind of following themes really with Paul's music. The guitar was his first instrument, actually. His father bought him a guitar when he was a boy. And this particular track that's coming up next is only, again, one of two that certainly I have of Paul playing the guitar in a session. It actually dates from 1961, and Ellington and Strayhorn were in Paris working on the soundtrack for the film Paris Blues. So there was kind of a bit of downtime for the orchestra, and various configurations of musicians from the orchestra made 3 albums together. There was one album by Harry Carney called Rock Me Gently. There was an album called the Bootywood All Stars, I think. And then there was this album that Paul made called Tenor Stuff with Harold Ashby, who Paul knew at the end of the 50s. I know it would be perhaps another 10 years before Harold Ashby actually played with the Ellington Orchestra itself. I think possibly he was involved in My People in the early 60s, not as a member of the Ellington Orchestra. But that was billed around 2 tenors and a rhythm section. Aaron Bell on bass from the Ellington Orchestra. Joe Jones, interestingly, because he played such a significant part. So it's alleged in the Newport festivities that fateful early morning, and Sir Charles Thompson on piano, about whom I know very little. So there are two tenors together, Harold Ashby and Paul Gonsalves, at the beginning of the track, playing in tandem, and then there's a very brief solo from Paul, a more extensive solo from Harold, which is kind of pure Ben Webster.
Yeah.
Realised how influenced he was by Ben Webster in his early days. I think that had gone largely by the time he came to play with Duke. But there's a very Websterian solo from Harold Ashby. And then we get quite a considerable guitar solo from Paul. And the guitar is such an important part of his own upbringing and his heritage, which I wanted to explore a little bit more in the track after this. But there's a fairly extensive guitar solo from Paul Gonsalves. And again, a bit like the way he plays the tenor, he's such a generous and risk-taking person. And there are all sorts of sounds come out of the guitar in this solo. The number is called Swallowing the Blues, and it was written by a British musician called Kenny Graham, who in fact wrote all the compositions for the Harry Carney album, I think, and contributed this particular track to the Tenor Stuff album. So there's a little bit of dialogue between Paul on guitar and Aaron Bell on bass towards the end of the number, and some in tandem playing from, as I say, a very Ben Webster-like Harold Ashby. But it's the guitar solo particularly drawn to share this track today. So it's called Swallowing the Blues.
To Latin
Yeah, so
America.
that, as I say, very Ben Websterish, Harold Ashby, some tenor from Paul, but quite an extensive guitar solo. And as I say, he seemed to take some risks with that and gets all sorts of noises from the guitar, the kind of the strumming, almost like pizzicato. I'm sure we've got Jerry hanging off Tom's whiskers at some point. So it's quite a palette of sounds. And we were just discussing why he kind of couldn't do a Rain Dance with the Ellington Orchestra, so occasionally put down his own horn and take up the guitar, but it was only ever a rhythm instrument in the Ellington band. But there is a school of thought around Paul's talents as a saxophonist that, particularly with regard to chord progressions, having learnt the guitar and being a musician as a guitarist, that influenced perhaps the way he approached the construction of his solos and the way he played the tenor saxophone. And certainly his heritage is acknowledged very strongly in a lot of the literature about him, and particularly The book Backstory in Blue, John Foss has, I think I've got the book on the shelf over there, and talks about Paul's Cape Verdean heritage. Thank you.
John Fass-Morton.
John Fass-Morton, yeah. Backstory in Blue.
That's a different book, Frank, yeah.
Yeah. He talks quite a lot about Paul's Cape Verdean heritage, and around the New Bedford area was kind of where people who had left Cape Verde sort of gravitated to, and there was a very, very strong community of Cape Verdeans there. Very few made the transition from their folk music, I guess, for want of a better word, to jazz. But Paul was one of them. Another musician, a little younger than Paul, I think, was Horace Silver, who again is of Cape Verdean heritage and made that transition. But the guitar was a very, very strong feature of Cape Verdean music. And I don't know if we're ready to move on to the next track yet or not. But again,
we're hoping to. It's a great time to kind of segue, isn't it?
The discussion that we were having off stream there could be something that we could pick up on another occasion.
Sure.
The Duke Ellington relationship with guitar. Yes. Possibly banjo thrown in there as well, just for good measure. Sorry.
Literally throwing in the banjo. Yeah.
In.
As I was saying, Paul's Cape Verdean heritage was hugely important to him, quite understandably so. And his family came from that archipelago, and his father bought him a guitar, I guess, because their own folk or world music, whatever would be the appropriate label, was so important to the family. And one of Paul's close friends growing up, Joe Livramento, made something of a career of an alto player in the jazz field, was reunited with Paul, and a band leader called Phil Barboza. Again, I've got very scant discographical information about this. It's only what I can find on the backs of LP covers, kind of on eBay and places like that.
Hello. Right, have we lost Ian there?
Just put on the track, Anthony.
Yes, I think that's what we'll do.
He'll come back.
He'll probably arrive back again.
Play the track. They'll get the vibe. They'll get it.
Sure. Story de Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I think must have needed another shilling for the meter.
Yes, it's great to have you back in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that track's called Story de Paul, or The Story of Paul. I think he may have written it himself, but it appeared anyway on an album on the Cabo Verde label, which may be the only album that appeared on that particular label. And it was Phil Barbosa and his orchestra. We were just saying, certainly from the fact it's a stereo recording, I think it's the early 60s. And that does seem an unusual time for Paul to be making this kind of a record. I think it just says a lot about how important his heritage and his friendships were, and the music, that he appeared not just on that one track, but on about 8 of the tracks throughout the album, which carries a vocal for most of them. And I believe is what's called Morna, which is the national music of Cape Verdeans, and the rhythm is clearly important. It's almost kind of Buena Vista Social Club kind of music in a way. And it's certainly not what you would term jazz, is it? I don't think. But it was recognisably Paul playing the tenor and curling around those melodies and elaborating upon them in a way, again, which possibly fed into his development as an American musician and as a jazz player. His cousin, who was called John Jolie Gonsalves, was quite a bigwig, I think, in the Cape Verdean community around Boston. He was a politician. I think he got a couple of record dates together with Joe Livramento. And following Paul's appearance at Newport, the famous Incendiary 27 chorus solo, asked kind of how Paul had been able to do that. And Paul said, John, I think in Crioulo, which is kind of the Creole language, kind of African Portuguese language of his heritage. So hearing that kind of music, which is not jazz at all, but knowing how Paul viewed his family, his background, his music, the way that fed into his development as a musician, kind of sheds an interesting light on the famous solo, and as I say, on his development as a musician. And Ellington loved that kind of local colour, didn't he? Kind of Puerto Rican chaos, or caravan, or the Far East suite. The world was his oyster. And again, possibly that's something Ellington recognised in Paul's individuality in the music that he made. But we never heard anything quite like that, either with the Ellington Orchestra or in any of Paul's other albums. So he just sat.
Oh dear.
Okay.
So while we're waiting for Ian to drop back in again, thank you, Ian, for all of that about Cape Verde and so on. Frank.
Thank you.
Frank, have a go. Yes.
We're just going to look at a couple of aspects of Paul's style. And this will be evident in the next track, which we'll play in a second. But in my review of this fine book called The Duke Ellington Cambridge Companion, edited by Ed Green, I reviewed it for some different journals, as well as it came out in a recent copy of Blue Light. So perhaps some of you have read this. Anyway, I just want to read a small snippet from review, which might give the reader and the listener an idea of how Paul was such a strong voice for the band as a soloist. And this is just paragraph review. Ellington is forever celebrated for his presenting his orchestra as his instrument or voice, not only through the band members' playing of his music, but more importantly by allowing their unique solo voices and individual stylistic embellishments to create jointly that phenomenon known as Ellingtonia, the sound world of Duke and Billy, Cootie, Cat, Juan, Lawrence, Britt, Carney, Rabbit, Rogers, Otto, Barney. Examples of Ellingtonia include the serpentine melodicisms and veiled, smoky tonal color of Paul Gonsalves's tenor sax. Now, what I didn't recognize in some of the tracks that Ian played, referring to the Sabi Lewis, and even, yeah, and I would say those particularly two tracks, was that smoky tonal color. Now, I refer to, it's almost kind of a veiled, it's not a bright, brittle electric sound. It's a very embracing kind of warmth that it's got a lot of sliding in it. The notes just kind of slide into each other. And this was evident in a lot of players he influenced. The best example I can think of is someone who is very much still with us today, the great English saxophonist and clarinetist Tony Coe. Now, Tony Coe has a distinctive sound that I think is an influence from Paul. Although I don't know if I would ever ask Tony, because he's a distinctive guy and often, doesn't like to be put into sort of influenced by or categories. But despite that, Dan Morgenstern presented a program on an American radio show of part of WBGO in Newark, New Jersey, called Jazz from the Archives. And many of you will know about Dan Morgenstern. And he did liken Tony Coe to Paul. So I find it interesting. Don't forget that Tony Coe played with Humphrey Littleton in the late 1950s. Can you imagine Tony Coe with Humphrey Littleton? You can take that where you like. But Anthony, if you'll kindly play this recording of Satin Doll, arranged by probably Strayhorn, and it was about 1958. Does that sound right? Indigos? Anyone out there?
Yeah, 58.
Prize?
57,
Yeah.
probably.
Okay,
I'd have to just check. I'd have to look that up.
No, that sounds pretty close to me. The point being is that Ellington took an entire.
Is this from Indigos?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm pretty sure. We'll have to check that, but it was certainly that period, Ellington. But most of the songs on Indigos were standard songs, Days of Wine and Roses, that sort of stuff. Not that one, but that sort of standard popular song.
Let's just mute Mike there.
Okay, here we go. Satin Doll.
Satin Doll.
Paul Gonsalves featured with the Ellington Orchestra.
Oh, this is one of these WMA files. Let's just start that again, because that did skip there.
Oh, sorry about that. That was Paul Gonsalves playing a treatment of Ellington's classic Satin Doll, which I just realized was recorded as a collection of 8 CDs of Ellington, something to do with the unreleased Ellington. Sorry about that. I gave you the wrong album.
Okay.
Anyway, we're going to move on and hear a live version dedicated to Paul's centenary of Ellington's 1934 classic
Satin Doll. No.
Lady. Sorry. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful Ellington classic, Sophisticated Lady. And I would like now to turn it back to our illustrious guest, Ian Bradley.
Oh, well, I felt surely somewhere on the playlist we must have that barnstorming performance from Newport, which I know the full diminuendo and crescendo is about 15 minutes. So I hope nobody would mind my just lifting the 5 minutes or so of the 27 of Paul's choruses. It's something Ellington himself did later, isn't it, when it became blow by blow and in triplicate and all of those kinds of things. So I hope I'll be forgiven for excising just a little bit from that particular performance.
Well, I hope so too.
I know that Ellington said afterwards, I was born at Newport, didn't he, as part of his stage patter. I suppose in many ways you think, well, Paul Gonsalves was born to play Newport, and everything obviously just fell together on that particular evening. And I'm sure or early morning, and I'm sure the story of it's very familiar to all of us who would tune into a presentation like this. I'm sure there are about 4 elements to the performance, just to go through them very quickly. The one I'm least qualified to comment on is the music itself, and obviously the ingenuity and the stamina that Paul Gonsalves demonstrated to get through those 27 choruses in the way he did. It was kind of lightning in a bottle. Almost a presagure of the 60s and the whole festival scene in some ways. Again, I'm not a musician to give a technical description, but it seems to me weaves very closely in and around the irresistible pulse and beat that Sam Woodyard sets up on the drums, and which popular law tells us was accentuated by Joe Jones thumping out the rhythm as well. With the Christian Science Monitor was the publication that it was said he used, but a rolled up newspaper anyway. Sure. He'd been appearing at Newport with Teddy Wilson, and was there when Ellington performed. So the propulsive driving rhythm was one element. I think Elaine Anderson's famous dance as well kind of brought a certain kind of notoriety to the evening's performance, and that again passed into legend. And as ever, Paul was on kind of home ground with Newport, Rhode Island, and a strong contingent of Cape Verdeans glad to welcome home the hero and cheer him along as well. So I think all of those ingredients came into play. The Dave Brubeck Quartet was appearing earlier that day, I think, and his alto saxophonist Paul Desmond said to Paul Gonsalves afterwards, that was the most, I can't remember the exact word, I think authentic performance of the entire festival. And again, with Paul Gonsalves' honesty and risk-taking, some of that, I'm sure, played its part in this kind of legendary performance. So I thought to blow his candles out with some fashion and style, we should listen to that famous 27 chorus solo.
Let's count them all. Hey, there we go. Excerpt from Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue featuring Paul Gonsalves, Newport Jazz Festival 1956. The American Jazz Festival at Newport in 1956 there. Mike Coates is the chairman of the Duke Ellington Society UK. By the way, if you want to chat with us, we've still got a bit of the show to go actually. Do visit our Discord channel, go to our website, dukeellington.org.uk, and there, if you click the link, that will take you to our Discord chat room. So anyway, Mike is the chairman, and he's joined us here. And Mike, you wanted to say a little bit about Paul.
I did really, because to me, and this is very much a personal aspect of Paul Gonsalves, to me, he never seems to get his dues, as it were, as far as his role in Ellington is concerned. A few minutes ago, Frank read out what I thought was an excellent little summary of the role that Paul Gonsalves played in the Ellington band. And then we subsequently heard the Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue. And I don't think, in a way, that Paul Gonsalves did himself any favours by playing that, brilliant though it is, because everybody knows him for that, but not for the things that Frank read out in terms of the role that he played in the band. It kind of eclipses the other things that Paul Gonsalves did. And I have to say, this viewpoint is coloured a little bit by an extract that's in this book, which is not an Ellington book. It's a kind of a summary of what was happening in Britain around the end of the 1990s. But there's an article in it by Peter Clayton, who many may remember, did an excellent show on a Sunday night on BBC Two,
Certainly,
called The Sounds of Jazz. And in fact, he conducted a large number of interviews with a variety of musicians from any corner of jazz that you care to mention. And he writes about these interviews, and he makes the point that one of the saddest ones, which he never broadcast, he had with Paul Gonsalves. And it's only a couple of paragraphs about this interview that never existed, as it were, because he was speaking to Paul Gonsalves, and seemingly the instrument, the tenor, was up on the bed in the hotel room that they were talking. And Paul was having marital problems with family life at home, and he was commenting on that, and he made the point that his wife didn't understand that he was really married to the tenor, not to his wife, as it were. And another little thing then came into the commentary that Clayton was making, and he said that after Paul Gonsalves died, he found, or was told, which apparently was quite correct, that in Paul Gonsalves' passport, his next of kin was listed as the Duke Ellington Orchestra. And to me, that's quite a sad commentary on a musician who obviously had a family life. And I do find that somehow, and perhaps this is just me rather than the jazz world in general and Ellington enthusiasts in particular, I find him a character that never seems to come out, not in the way that Ray Nance comes out, or Rex Stewart came out, or Johnny Hodges, or Harry Carney. And getting back to Frank's little comment on the role that another observer saw Paul Gonsalves and the role he played in the band, to me, it never seems to come out. Brilliant musician, though Paul was, and we've heard some of the aspects of his playing today. And I wonder if you've any idea, Ian, how the other members of the Ellington group, when Gonsalves was a member, kind of viewed him were.
Yeah, I do know he was, things I've read about him, he was a very shy man. And it's strange then that the music is the way it sounds. And I think sometimes when you're quite shy or introspective, occasionally you'll go so far the other way. I mean, obviously I never saw the Ellington band live. I never saw them perform, or Paul Gonsalves. I've seen videos and photographs. And in compensating for his privacy and his shyness, I think he could sometimes be there's almost kind of like an antic disposition to the way he comes across. I know Ellington called him the strolling violins because he would like to go out into the audience and play with his tenor there, actually in the midst of them. And I've seen videos of him performing in that way. And it's almost as if he's kind of overcompensating for this kind of privacy or insecurity. I know Clark Terry said that he had to remind Paul to send postcards to his family when he was away with the orchestra, which was obviously most of the time, because Paul was kind of careless, in the nicest kind of way about himself, his own well-being, perhaps even those closest to him. I know he had a stepdaughter who said, whilst Paul's marriage unfortunately came to grief and ended, the family kind of fell apart when he wasn't there himself. And Lawrence Brown spoke very warmly of Paul as well. I think in many ways he was kind of an innocent. I think Ellington said, without a trace of irony, that he could have been a priest. And there is something about Paul Gonsalves that, as I say, that kind of that risk taking and that kind of putting himself forward, that was kind of quite at odds, maybe in some ways, with the sort of man he was. So I think he's kind of careless in a way. I mean, the next track that I've got for us to listen to was recorded in London in 1963, and you kind of don't want to dwell on these aspects too much, but to do Paul justice, he had very strong links to Britain. Frank mentioned Tony Coe, and I think Tony Coe was actually on one of the sessions with Paul and with Tubby Hayes. Yeah. I've not brought any of the Tubby Hayes recordings today, unfortunately, but there were 2 albums with Tubby Hayes, of four albums recorded in the UK, which were financed by Jackie Sharp, who owned a jazz club in Old Holborn for a while and was a bit of a kind of a fixer for musicians. I know he was involved with Tubby Hayes and involved with Paul Gonsalves as well, which may be how this particular album came into being. The album is called Boom Jackie Boom Chick, and it was the first of 4 albums that Paul recorded in London, which Jackie Sharp financed. There were only, I think, 500 copies pressed, and they go for thousands of pounds now if an original pressing kind of turns up. And it's sort of Paul's almost, it's one of my favourite albums, and it's kind of Paul's almost kind of blue album. And that Smokey Gonsalves that you were mentioning earlier, Frank, I think that manifests itself on this album. There's a beautiful version of I Should Care as a ballad, but the track I've chosen is called Village Blues, and there's a second phantom tenor player playing behind Paul at the beginning and at the end of the track, and that tenor player is Jackie Sharp. And the journalist and biographer Derek Jewell said kind of Paul, he was never looked after wonderfully, sadly, when he was in the UK. And Jackie Sharp was one of the movers there, supplying him with drugs or with things to meet the addictions he suffered from. And that kind of plays into a certain aspect of Paul. One of the things I find most attractive about his music is its vulnerability. Even in things like the storming 27 chorus at Newport, I always think of him as a very kind of a vulnerable, quite a quixotic personality, a man who didn't take sufficient care of himself and took all sorts of risks. And it feels wrong somehow to kind of enjoy the beautiful music, which was made, I think, in spite of that, not because of. But Paul, those addictions was perhaps never far away from that side. There was a mask and a clownishness, and he was almost like a kind of a holy innocent. And I do agree, Mike, that I debated about including the 27 choruses and thought, how can you not talk about him without mentioning those? But as he said himself, that became a bit of a burden. It was almost like an albatross, like the Ancient Mariner having to tell that same story on demand. There was so much more beauty and vulnerability to him, particularly in the way he handled ballads. This track is a John Coltrane number, Village Blues. I chose it because Jackie Sharp is in the background. But again, as you say, Frank, that kind of smoky, intimate side. And you hear the two saxophones at the beginning, and then it's almost as if Paul slips away from that and out from that. And you get this very kind of ruminative, kind of quiet solo. It's an interesting track. The whole album's a beautiful album, financed by a man whose part in the Paul Gonsalves story perhaps was kind of a little bit ambiguous. But for sure, there was so much to him as a musician and as a man, and so much of that you find in his music as well. So say this track from the album Boom Jackie Boom Chick. Needless to say, I don't have a vinyl of this. This is one of the CD iterations. I think it's quite easily available nowadays, but a beautiful album and a testament to all those things you said, Mike, which often aren't addressed, but which are there in his music and in what he contributed. And I know Ellington would have had his own artistic imperative, wouldn't he? The Ellington band was the Ellington band. And I know that Paul found that less of a straitjacket than Basie or Gillespie. But when he was away from Ellington, there were many, many different sides to him. And I think this album, it certainly shows those extra dimensions. was Village Blues from 1963, the first of 4 albums that Paul recorded in the UK. Though the liner notes on the back claimed it was recorded in Switzerland because of the problems with the Musicians' Union between America and the UK. So that was Sinclair Trail, the founder of Jazz Journal. Slightly fictionalised things, but it was recorded at the Decca Studios, I think. A beautiful sounding album. So just aware of the time, and to stay in the UK, to bring Paul back to Duke and some kind of absolution after thinking about all of these dark things. Happy reunion. I find Paul's music neither happy nor sad, but beautiful. That was a word that Duke Ellington used about Paul's family. It was a word that Paul's fellow musicians used about him as a beautiful human being. And this track in particular, I think, shows the beauty of his music. And for all the technique and the skill, and he was a premier musician, he's at that level almost where the instrument becomes invisible, it disappears. You're not hearing a saxophone, you're hearing Paul Gonsalves. And this track it was recorded live in Bristol in 1971. I think it's just a duet. It's Ellington at the piano, almost like this carry-on kind of setting up of Happy Reunion. In his introduction, Ellington calls him the hero of Newport, and I find Paul Gonsalves a heroic figure. And this is perhaps his most beautiful performance of Happy Reunion.
We are aware of the time, but we're not letting it worry us too much.
Thank you. Now the hero of the Newport Jazz Festival, Paul Gonsalves, and Happy Reunion.